Serious, what was the dirtiest trick ever pulled in the history of war? During the Second World War, German forces would rig crooked wall paintings to explode when straightened with hopes that it would kill Allied officers when they came in to set up command posts. When Timur the Lame was about to attack the city of Shivas, he promised the 3,000 Christian Armenian Sipahis that he would not shed any of their blood if they surrendered. They did. And, true to his word, he had them all buried alive. In World War I, the Allies became used to the smell of chemical weapons and would put their gas masks on quickly. The Germans changed their tactics and would use nearly odorless vomit-inducing chemicals that would absorb quickly into the lungs first. Then, once soldiers were vomiting and couldn't keep their gas masks on, they would fire the main artillery barrage containing the lethal chemicals. The actor George Sanders found out that his friend, David Niven, was very chummy with Winston Churchill during the war. He asked Niv to give the Prime Minister a note detailing his idea for a new bomb that the RAF could drop on German cities. It would be exactly the same as all the old bombs, except it would have a wind-activated siren attached to it. So when the bombs dropped, the German civilian population hiding in shelters would hear the siren, think that the all clear was being sounded and come out. Just as the bombs hit. Niven didn't say how Churchill took the idea. Not sure if this counts as a trick, but Napoleon, prior to the Battle of Marengo, not only did he cross the Alps with his entire army, a completely unexpected move, but once across, the Austrians thought Napoleon would move to Genoa in order to relieve the siege of that city. Thousands were dying of starvation, and French General Massena desperately called for Napoleon's aid. Napoleon, in a ruthless and surprising move, ignored the calls for help and instead moved to attack the main portion of the Austrian army, eventually winning the Battle of Marengo. Massena surrendered Genoa, and it would be years before he eventually forgave Napoleon for abandoning him, and it would be years before Napoleon forgave Massena for surrendering. The Battle of Maynoon in the Iraqi-Iranian War. You wait until nighttime, and you will see how we are killing these Iranian dogs. An Iraqi officer said with a broad grin. We are frying them like eggplants. He then took us on a tour of dozens of thick electrical cables his troops had lain through the marshy battlefield. A spaghetti network that snaked in and out of the patchwork of lagoons. He showed us the mammoth electric generators that fed the exposed power lines from positions just behind the Iraqi front lines. And when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards made their regular evening advance, the officer and his men demonstrated the macabre genius of their invention. Iraqi gun batteries fired just enough artillery to force the Revolutionary Guards from their marsh boats. And when hundreds of them had been forced to continue their advance through the lagoons on foot, the men manning the Iraqi generators flipped a few switches and sent thousands of volts of electricity surging through the marshland. Within seconds, hundreds of Iranians were electrocuted. Before the Battle of Yorktown, US Civil War, Confederate General Magruder was able to convince McClellan that he had 40,000 troops manning his defenses, rather than his actual force of 10,000. He found a point in the defenses where he knew his troops would be observed and counted, and marched them past that point several times. McClellan had 120,000 troops and superior artillery, but like always, hesitated to attack even with superior numbers. He also thought that another general was approaching with 60,000 men, close to the actual number, and didn't want to attack Magruder's 40,000 and be hit by the 60,000 as well. So he waited for his own reinforcements and more reconnaissance. If he had attacked Magruder, he would have overwhelmed him and been able to prepare for Johnston's arrival. Instead, he waited to attack until Magruder's forces were reinforced. Johnston arrived and added even more troops, and the Confederates were eventually able to slip away from the battle with only 300 casualties. TLDR. Magruder marched troops in a circle past his enemies, making 10,000 men look like 40,000, causing the cautious McClellan to hesitate and waste the opportunity. The British pulled a dirty trick during the African campaign in World War II. At every well and oasis they could find they hung a sign that said danger. Poison. In English and German. It was only when the Germans complained that poisoning wells was a war crime that the British pointed out that yes, poisoning wells was a crime. But merely hanging signs was not. The water was perfectly drinkable. I've had a bunch of requests for sources, but I cannot for the life of me find where I read it originally. The closest references I can find are to the British creating fake minefields out of nothing but signs in the Second Boer War, and some very impressive British World War II camouflage in Operation Bertram. According to some records in the art of war, it is considered a good strategy to corner your men and have the enemy attempt to wipe them out. Because when the only means of escape survival is through the enemy, then your own men will fight to the death. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. If they will face death, there is nothing they may not achieve. The Russians and their use of a scorched earth policy. I can't think of a better way to flip off your invaders than ruining all your own tea so when they do take it, it's worthless. Not only that, but the land itself is just too damn cold. So go ahead. Take the land. You will just freeze to death. Congratulations. Russia also gets to enjoy a strategy almost no one else gets to enjoy. Retreating because there's so much land versus their neighbors. The enemy must advance and stretch out their supply lines, while Russia shortens their supply lines. Genghis Khan. In a large-scale attack against the fortress at Volohay, after being unable to breach the walls, demanded 1,000 cats and 10,000 Chinese swallows in exchange for lifting the siege. When the defenders sent out the animals, Genghis took them and tied tufts of cotton to their tails and ignited them. At which point the animals rushed back to their homes within the city, igniting hundreds of small fires. Not so dirty. But Turks had the Turan tactic. The army would form it into a crescent, with the arms of the crescent being the armored, strong divisions and middle front being the fastest divisions and middle back being the highest firepower, cannons. They'd start the battle lined up and charge. Then the fast middle front guys would start retreating to the lines behind the middle back, the cannons. The arms of the crescent would hold firm because they were the armored part. The enemy would think they were retreating completely, because it looks like they are losing their shti and also their formation, and will chase after them only to be met with the cannons and to be encircled by the crescent's arms. It was a slaughter of the enemy after that. Washington crossing the Delaware. Sneaked into the Hessian camp while they were drunk and celebrating Christmas. 3 American losses versus 22 losses on the Hessian side and 1,000 prisoners. Capture of their weapons, gunpowder, and supplies. So there's this kind of honey made in Turkey called mad honey. It's made from the pollen of rhododendron flowers. If you eat very much of it, you get very intoxicated, and you often hallucinate. You can even OD on it. A few times in antiquity, it was used as a weapon of war. For example, the Persians left some out for the Romans to find. The Romans are that sweet tea right up. And then the Persians attacked them while they were all tripping balls and defenseless. Back in the English Civil War, there was a certain nobility in battle where you were supposed to be able to see your opponents and you would stand and fight. Cromwell decided this was stupid and in numerous battles would send troops round the side hidden by trees and bushes to tear through the cavaliers before the fight properly began. I think the start of World War II when Hitler made prisoners dress like Polish soldiers and let them attack Germany so that Germany could run over Poland. Also promising not to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia after being given all their border defenses. Then proceeding to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia basically unopposed. Edit. He always invited the Czech president to Germany before the invasion so he couldn't help defend his country. Hopefully it hasn't been mentioned already, but some of the USA's tricks during the Cold War to assassinate Fidel Castro were pretty mad. One idea attempted by the CIA included putting thallium salts into his shoes so that his beard, eyebrows and body hair to fall out. It was considered that this would cause his downfall as no one would take him seriously after that. Hannibal's snake-filled pots, which were loaded onto catapults. There was a time of World War I called Live and Let Live, both sides essentially refusing to fight and coming out of the trenches together, socializing. After the generals on one side, I think it was the British, but could be wrong, found out about this. They devised a dirty trick. The British lured the Germans out of their trench by playing a traditional German anthem and cut them all down, thus ending the days of Live and Let Live from Radiolab program about morality, a truly mind-blowing episode. The US firebombed Tokyo. Because the houses were mostly made of wood, they knew the city would burn. Even the guy who drafted the plan, Robert McNamara, was ashamed of it. They also tried strapping thermite to bats and releasing them over Japan, in the hope they would roost in the houses, then go off and burn the houses down. The plan was cancelled after all the facilities where this was being tested burned down due to incendiary bats roosting in them. Scipio Africanus was fighting against the Carthaginians. One battle in particular. Both sides lined up in battle formation for consecutive days. Each side was also using Iberian mercenaries on their flanks, with their native troops in the center. Several days passed with no actual fighting. Eventually Scipio Africanus ordered that his Roman legionaries line up on the flanks rather than the Iberian mercenaries. As expected, the Carthaginians lined up the original way and Scipio ordered his troops to attack. The Roman legionaries, being better equipped and better trained, crushed the Iberians fighting for the Carthaginians and rolled up their flanks. This ended up being a decisive victory for the Romans. Edit. This was the Battle of Ilipa in case you were wondering. Maybe not the dirtiest, but according to my point of view a very unethical trick. Near the end of the Great War, Italy and Austria signed a contract of peace on the 3rd of November 1918. The Austrians thought that the contract was valid from the moment the signature was written. But in fact the contract became valid on the several days after the 3rd of November. But the Austrian troops have already started to travel back home. Thus South Tyrol was unprotected. The Italian army recognized that and silently invaded South Tyrol. The dirty trick comes now. An Italian named Ettore Tolomei always wanted South Tyrol to become a part of Italy. So he translated the names of very common locations into the Italian language. Then he presented his map to the Allies, claiming that South Tyrol had previously been a part of Italy. Due to that lie, South Tyrol was promised to Italy in the Treaty of London. Since then our small region is a part of Italy. Has anyone said Agent Orange in the Vietnam War? We couldn't really fight them because they used guerrilla warfare in the dense jungles. So we basically bombed the jungles with Agent Orange, which is an extremely toxic herbicide, to clear out the jungles. This has caused some really f***ed up health effects for multiple generations in Vietnam. Not to mention the environmental effects. Correct me if my facts are wrong. I'm not a history buff. Sherman's march to the sea during the American Civil War has to be up there. The idea of total war, where you take a shitload of troops, match them somewhere full of civilians, and burn shit to the ground. Sherman literally went to Georgia and had his men march to the sea ocean and made them destroy all the infrastructure in their path. It worked right into the Union's general plan of suffocating the South and squeezing every cent out of their economy by blocking up almost all major ports in a place that relied heavily on importation, especially during war. Towards the end of the war, inflation had increased so heavily. Back in the 15th century when the Spanish invaded Holland, in a town called Naarden they organized a town meeting where they were going to inform everyone how Spanish and Dutch could peacefully coexist. When all the Dutch gathered in the town hall they were locked up and the town hall was set to fire. Spanish scumbags. I read somewhere about a high-ranking officer in the Chinese military that was infamous among enemies and allies for his cleverness and ability to come up with unique war tactics. During some war, the enemy army was marching towards some strategically valuable location. The general, knowing he could not let his army take the location, rode to a town that the army had to pass through to get there, and sets up his plan. As the enemy army approaches the town, they see this general, all alone, sitting on an arch above the entrance playing a flute. They turn right the FCK around and abandon the plan, fearing some brutal and elaborate ambush. The general was bluffing. He was the only person there. Edit. Please look at the comment below by Ujangwei23 for some further specifics by someone who clearly knows way more about this than I do. Good work. After Dinah was arped by Shesem of Canaan, the Israelites pretended to accept the others of their tribe into the fold if they would get circumcised like the Israelites. When the entire enemy camp was circumcised and in pain, the next day they attacked and slaughtered everyone. When the Mongols sieged Efazov, they threw infected bodies over the walls. So say they loaded like 90 kilograms of bodies on it. How far do you think they would be able to throw the bodies? When Germany pretended Poland invaded first and then proceeded to blitzkrieg the shit out of Poland at the beginning of the Second World War. War elephants basically FCK everything up. There is one way to defeat them though. You slather some pigs in sticky flammable stuff, set them on fire, and let them loose. This freaks the war elephants out and they become useless. When the Great Wall of China was built to keep out the Mongols, one tactic was to lead a small suicide charge at the wall. They would then play dead, to the point of having limbs broken and not reacting. And when they came out to collect the bodies, would all rush through with reinforcements. The Mongols did a lot of smart, dirty shit like this. Read the Conqueror books by Connie Gilden if you're interested. The Tet Offensive and the Vietnamese War. Letting the Germans bomb Coventry, so that the Germans wouldn't suspect that their codes were cracked and the British knew they were going to bomb Coventry. This is actually a myth. The truth of the matter is that Enigma is complex, and while it could be cracked typically in hours, sometimes it took longer. The day that the messages about Coventry were being sent, they just didn't decipher the codes in time. England, and the Allies in general, had an extensive spy and counter-spy network during World War II. So they could have easily ensured a false message or two from a spy was intercepted, to make it look like that was where the info came from. Should they want to keep Bletchley secret? Foolish Germans. I'm surprised I haven't seen Pearl Harbor yet. Maybe when Hitler attacked Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin was so furious and perhaps disappointed that he didn't do any public speeches or appearances for more than 2 weeks. Stalin didn't feel betrayed by Hitler. He knew an attack was coming, he just didn't expect it quite so quickly. Coating razor wire in anticoagulant. Dart. Despite their reputation, Canadian soldiers in World War I were prone to the vicious behavior of the war as any other of the period. By the later half of the war, the concept of trench raids became a prevailing method of engaging the enemy. One Canadian soldier recounted a particularly sneaky incident involving cans of beef. Discovering that the Germans had a knack for Canadian canned beef, a Canadian raiding party snuck up on the German trench line and lobbed a can over. At first the Germans reacted as if it was a grenade. But when a second can went over, they started to gather to see the event. They called for more, grouping together, excited to finally get a taste of some long-missed meat. Eventually, once a large enough group had gathered, the Canadian soldiers called out, "Eat this," and lobbed all their grenades in on their quarry. For more stories like this, I highly recommend Tim Cook's At the Sharp End and Stormtroops on a readable and comprehensive guide to Canadian infantrymen in World War I. Russia claiming that Ukraine war, massacring its Russian-speaking citizens in eastern Ukraine and then sending in unmarked soldiers to those territories was pretty dirty. Also shooting down an airliner, boasting about it on national TV, but then suddenly claiming it was not them when they realized it was a civilian plane. Also, sending troops to Crimea and then declaring that there was an honest referendum. Also, Russian-Finnish war was pretty much the same as the situation described above. Same methods, same propaganda headlines. Awaiting the coming of the Russian bots any minute now. The French Maginot Line. The Germans invaded France through a tiny hole in their defense. They just went round the end of it. Actually, there are no dirty tricks in war. Winning a war involves cunning and deception. There's rules, man. Maybe the scorched earth booby trap Germany used during World War I. This is more cheeky than dirty. But the fact that the Germans were manufacturing the new version of the Carbiner and named it the Carbiner 98 Kurz. This obviously being because they weren't allowed to make bolt-action rifles, but only allowed to make carbines. And Kurz of course means short. So basically, it was a carbine version of the regular Carbiner. Except that it wasn't a carbine at all. And was only named that to fool the others. Again. Not that dirty, but cheeky. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the Soviets would leave teddy bears with explosives in them for children to find. They were intended to severely injure the children, but hopefully not kill. The rationale being that parents couldn't evacuate an area as quickly because they would be caring for the injured child. Hey Indians, here are some blankets. It gets cold at night. Probably during World War II when the British adopted radar. The radar allowed them to see the location, speed, and direction of travel of German bombers in the night. It was hugely successful. And this is where the trickery comes in. In order to protect this technological advantage, Britain instead launched a propaganda campaign claiming F King Carrots gave you night sight. The British Ministry of Health even backed it up. This spread like wildfire throughout the world. Your parents probably still tell you carrots improve your sight. It's all a lie.